In this unit, we're going to be looking at several things related to ecology. So first, let's talk about what ecology is. Well, it comes from the Greek word oikos, meaning house or place to live, and specifically it's a study of how organisms interact with each other and with the non-living environment. When we talk about ecology, we often look at things at different levels within the environment. So we might look at something at the organism level, which is any form of life and is kind of considered to be the basic unit of ecology. And when we're looking at organisms, we're typically going to be talking about a specific species. And a species is a group of organisms that resemble one another in appearance, behavior, chemistry, and genetic makeup. And as far as the biological definition, we say that they are able to produce fertile offspring in nature. So as an example, the mule. Mules come from a combination of a horse and a donkey. Well, horses and donkeys are separate species because they would not choose to reproduce in nature. And when we force the issue and they have an offspring, the offspring, the mule, is infertile. And so that's why horses and donkeys are separate species. Next up in terms of the level that we might study would be populations. So a population is a group of individuals of the same species in the same area. We might look at things like habitat, distribution, or their range, things like that. So maybe a herd of cows would be a population. All right, then we have the community level, which is all of the populations of different species that live in a particular area. So the cows, the grass, the insects, the bacteria, anything that's living that is in the same area. And then above that, we have the ecosystem level, which adds in the non-living components. So it's all of the communities and the non-living environment in a particular area. And then the biosphere is everywhere on Earth where there is life. All right, I want to back up for just a second and talk a little more about species. So scientists believe that there's somewhere between 10 and 15 million species, of which we have identified and named about 1.4 million of those species. And I want you to notice in this picture here which type of species is the most numerous, and that would be the insects. That might be a surprise. A lot of folks would have thought, I think, bacteria would be the most numerous, but it's actually the insects. So almost half, or slightly more than half, of the known species are insects. When we talk about ecosystems, remember that we're looking at both the living and non-living components. And so the living components we call the biotic factors: plants, algae, fungi, bacteria, animals. The non-living things are called abiotic factors and would include water, air, temperature, and soil. When we're looking at those biotic factors, we're often going to be talking about kind of their role in the ecosystem. So you have your producers, which are also called autotrophs, which means self-feeders. These guys make their own food and include plants, algae, some bacteria, and phytoplankton. Most of those guys are going to do photosynthesis, which uses energy from the sun to produce carbohydrates. And you may be familiar with the equation. It's 6 carbon dioxides plus 6 waters yields glucose plus 6 oxygen. And then similar to that is a process called chemosynthesis, where they're using energy from chemicals such as hydrogen sulfide instead of sunlight to make those carbohydrates. And this is going to happen in like the deep, dark parts of the ocean where the sun can't go. And then, of course, we have our consumers, which are also called heterotrophs or other feeders. They get their energy by feeding on other organisms. They could be primary consumers, which are your herbivores, or secondary consumers or higher, tertiary, quaternary, which will be your carnivores or omnivores. And then, of course, the decomposers that break down all the dead stuff. In addition, we also might talk about something like a detrivore, which are more or less kind of like scavengers. So all living things do respiration. Respiration is when organisms break down the food to obtain the energy they need. It can either be aerobic or anaerobic. So aerobic, if you remember, breaks down food using oxygen, and it's the reverse equation of photosynthesis. So it's going to be glucose plus 6 oxygen yields 6 carbon dioxide plus 6 water. Anaerobic respiration or fermentation, on the other hand, breaks down food in the absence of oxygen. So here we have a food chain, which you may notice is just a linear sequence of organisms showing who feeds on whom. And the trophic levels are identified here. Trophic level just is the level that they feed at. So the first trophic level will always be your producers. The second trophic level will always be your herbivores. And then you have your third trophic level and fourth trophic level and so on. You're typically not going to go much farther than the fourth trophic level, and we'll talk about why in just a moment. But that's what those levels kind of refer to as where they're found in the food chain, or as we'll see in a moment, the food web. So one thing I want you to notice is the direction of the arrows. The arrows show the path of energy through the food chain. So the energy goes from the sun to the producers, from the producers to the herbivores, and so on. And then you'll see that they're showing the loss of heat as the energy is transferred through the food chain. And we'll talk a little more about that in a few moments. All right, so here we have a food web. Now, food webs are a little more realistic in terms of showing all of the feeding relationships in a particular ecosystem, where the food chain just shows a single possible sequence of feeding relationships. The food web is basically a bunch of interconnected food chains. And so it gets a lot more complex, but more realistic, because most things feed on more than one type of food. But same thing, the arrows are showing the direction of the energy flow through the food web. So this is what I was talking about that we'd come back to. So each trophic level contains a certain amount of biomass, which is the dry weight of all organic matter contained in its organism. And energy transfer from one level to the next is not very efficient between those trophic levels. So some of that energy is going to be lost as heat, as we saw on the food chain and as we see here on this energy pyramid. And turns out that in terms of efficiency, ecological efficiency, it ranges from about 2% to 40% as far as how much energy gets passed to the next level. But 10% is about average. That's what's actually available to the next level. So they're showing here that the producers have 10,000 units of usable energy. The next level, the primary consumers, they're only going to have 1,000 units of energy available. The secondary consumers are only going to have 100, and the tertiary are only going to have 10. This is why there's a limit to the size or length of the food chain, because the higher you feed, the less energy you get from your food, and the more you have to eat to make up for that. So that's really what limits the length of the food chains. So productivity refers to kind of how much energy the producers supply in an ecosystem. So there's two things that we look at. Gross primary productivity, or GPP, is the rate at which an ecosystem's producers convert solar energy into chemical energy. So this would be like on your paycheck, the gross pay before they take everything out, right? This is the maximum amount. But then we have net primary productivity, or NPP, which is the rate at which producers use photosynthesis to store energy minus the rate at which they use some of that energy for respiration. So again, your net pay on your paycheck is minus all of the stuff that they take out for taxes and all of that fun stuff. So same thing here. So net primary productivity is gross primary productivity minus respiration. And so basically it's how fast producers can provide food needed by consumers. So you'll see here that in the terrestrial ecosystems, the swamps and marshes and the tropical rainforests, they are the highest in net primary productivity. And then in the aquatic ecosystems, it's actually the estuaries that are the highest producers of energy. All right, the last thing we're going to talk about in this video is very briefly a discussion of the cycles. You guys have had this multiple times, so I don't want to spend a lot of time on it, but we have the water cycle here, which primarily involves evaporation, precipitation, condensation, all those functions. Okay, so evaporation, the water evaporates from land or from the water and goes up into the atmosphere where it condenses into liquid again and then falls back to Earth as precipitation. And so it's this constant cycle of water through the atmosphere and through the land. All right, the carbon cycle we're going to look at in two parts. First, we're going to look at the terrestrial portion of the carbon cycle, which primarily involves kind of generally speaking, just respiration and photosynthesis, as photosynthesis removes carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and respiration puts it back. But you'll see other things here as well, like the combustion of wood. So when we burn trees, that's going to release carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. So fossil fuels store carbon, and then when we burn them, we release the carbon. Rocks store a lot of carbon. And then the food webs are going to show the movement of the carbon through the terrestrial ecosystem. Now, on the aquatic level, it's still the same type of stuff. We're still going to be looking at photosynthesis and respiration as the main movers of carbon, but there's a lot of carbon in the ocean. So bicarbonate and carbonate that are dissolved in the ocean water. So a lot of times we'll actually refer to the ocean as being a carbon sink or a carbon reservoir because it contains a lot of carbon either in the bodies of organisms or in the water itself. The nitrogen cycle is an interesting one because even though a vast majority of our atmosphere is nitrogen gas, about 78%, we and other animals are not capable of taking the nitrogen directly from the atmosphere, but we have to have it to make proteins. And so we're dependent on bacteria to remove the nitrogen from the atmosphere through a process called nitrogen fixation. And then there are a couple of other processes that take place once the bacteria have pulled the nitrogen out of the atmosphere. It's converted into other forms through nitrification and ammonification. And then to return it back into the atmosphere, we have denitrification, which puts it back into gaseous form in the atmosphere. And then the phosphorus cycle is an interesting one because it's the only cycle that does not have an atmospheric component. The phosphorus is mainly going to be found in organisms, in water, in the rocks. So it's all terrestrial. There's nothing atmospheric about the phosphorus cycle.